4 of Daniel. We're going to continue our study through the first 6 chapters of this book, looking at the characters that we see and applying them to us today. So this morning we're going to kind of look at chapters 4 and then 5 here in a little bit too. So in chapter 3, if you recall, we had switched gears and kind of viewed the story of Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Here in chapter 4, we're coming back over to the character of Daniel. And it's kind of, there's a couple flip-flops between those two views throughout this book, but chapter 4 is all about Daniel and another vision by Nebuchadnezzar. It says in verse 1, King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. So even this Nebuchadnezzar character, not being a Jew, not being a follower of God, recognizes the importance of telling people what this God has done for him. I really think that it's one of the examples of, and we don't use this word very often, but we have our story, right? We have, and most people, when asked, well, what is your story? What is your testimony? Is usually the word we use. People think that they assume that we're asking about their conversion. And while sometimes that can be the testimony that you have, maybe that is the big change in your life. That is the point that made the most impact. But when I think about testimony, I think of situations like here with King Nebuchadnezzar. It's not all about the conversion story. When I ask about testimony, I mean I want to hear, how has God played a part in your life? How has he made himself known to you? You see, that is the story that impacts people. And when we go out and we talk about God, telling them about your conversion, yes, absolutely, that's important. But when you don't even believe in God, that really doesn't mean a whole lot. You see, if you want them to follow God, you have to tell them what God has done for you. You have to give them a reason to want to follow him. And I know that sounds selfish, but that's just the nature of things. When you're going to go out into the world and talk to worldly people about other worldly things, you have to make it apply to them. Continuing on in verse 4, it says, I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and the visions in my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. And the magicians, the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the astrologers came in, and I told them the dream, but they could not make known to me its interpretation. At last Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar, after the name of my God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream, saying, we're going to stop here for a second. So this is a little bit different from the last time Nebuchadnezzar was in this situation. If you recall, chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar made them tell him what the dream was, as well as asking for the interpretation. And that's why I had suggested to you that maybe it was one of those times where he knew he'd had a troubling dream but couldn't recall exactly what it was. And so he demanded that they also tell him what the dream was as well. He's not doing that here. He's actually telling them the dream. And really, when you look at the vision, we're going to see this here in a little bit. it's not complicated. Like the vision that he gives, it's not all that difficult. Even knowing we have hindsight on our side, it's not that difficult to interpret what this dream was meaning. So I think in this situation, I think God probably had a hand in this, in clouding people's view of this, because he wanted Daniel to be called in. He wanted Daniel to be a part of this. One of the questions I asked when I was looking through this chapter is why was Daniel a last resort? And we've already seen that Daniel can do all of these things. Why would Nebuchadnezzar not just default to him? Why was that not his first go-to? And that, I was reading through a lot of commentaries about this, and there was some of them that suggested that, well, it was King Nebuchadnezzar is a worldly man, he's not a godly man, and he went to God's man only as a last resort. I don't know that I agree that the text shows us that. I think probably what's happening here is that Daniel was placed in a position of authority within the realm. Okay? If you recall, Daniel was rewarded with a title and a position. He's essentially a governor of sorts at this point. Now, when you have somebody underneath you with a very important job that they're trying to fulfill, you're going to exhaust every other outlet you have before calling them off of that job to help. So if he's got these magicians, these astrologers, these Chaldeans, that's what they're supposed to do anyways, and that he has them available to him, why would he pull Daniel off of his job of governing his people when he can ask them first? I don't think that this is a worldly view or a sinful view on Nebuchadnezzar's part. I think that this is Nebuchadnezzar understanding that Daniel's already doing a job. That being said, there is an application here. I think that it's important to look at that. We have this trait in our own lives when we go through troubles, or when bad things happen, or we have some big thing in our way, some big task to be done. There's a lot of the times I don't even think about going to God in prayer until I've exhausted every effort. And that's contrary to, this specific situation. That's not really how we're supposed to be dealing with things as Christians. I talk to a lot of people that say, well, my prayer life is solid. I pray every morning. I pray before each meal, and I pray in the evening. But that line of communication with God, that's supposed to be a permanent thing. That's not a scheduled break in the day when we talk to God. That line of communication is supposed to remain open. Prayers, while it's good to stop what we're doing and set time aside to focus on that relationship, to focus on that dialogue with our Creator, your communication with Him is not limited to those times. When you're working at something, you can talk to God while you're doing that. When you're going about running errands, you can pray while driving. Obviously not with your eyes closed, but it can happen just the same, We aren't called to act like Nebuchadnezzar because we aren't Nebuchadnezzar. We aren't non-believers. We aren't worldly people. We are children of God. And our line of communication with our Father is supposed to remain open. Now we look at verse 10. It says, "The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw and behold a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, its fruits abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heaven lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree and lop off its branches, strip off its leaves and scatter its fruits. Let the beast flee from under it and the birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth and bound with a band of iron and bronze amid the tender grass of the field. Have any of you guys done splicing work with trees? That band that you put around the stump, it serves two purposes. It restricts that stump from growing, but it also protects it. It protects it from animals that would rub against it or eat it. It really serves those two purposes, and we see here that analogy stands when the interpretation is given. It says, let him be wet with the dew of heaven, let his portion be with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man, and let a beast's mind be given to him, and let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, and the decision by the word of the holy ones to the end, that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets it over the lowliest of men. Like I said, this is not a difficult thing, I don't think, to see what each parts of this dream means. But for whatever reason, whether it's God's hand or whether they were just not that brilliant, this task of interpreting it is once again left to Daniel. And we're going to see here in a minute that Daniel actually grieves a little bit over this dream. He actually prays that it's not going to be about Nebuchadnezzar. That he actually, you hear him say, let this be about your enemy. May it be for your enemies. So a lot of the times we see these kings in these stories, especially kings that aren't Jews, as tyrants, as bad guys. I don't think we can draw that conclusion about this guy. I think Nebuchadnezzar makes a lot of foolish decisions, and we're going to see more of them as we continue on with the story. But I think from Daniel's reaction to this, it's pretty clear that Daniel loved this man. Daniel cared deeply for this man. It says, 19, or in verse 19, it says, then Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was dismayed for a while, and his thoughts alarmed him. The king answered and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream of Peter or the interpretation alarm you. Belteshazzar answered and said, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. The tree you saw, which grew and became strong, so that its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, whose leaves were beautiful and its fruits abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field found shade, and whose branches the birds of heaven lived. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reached to the heavens, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. Now, I want to point out that the prophets have a habit of speaking like this, especially to leaders. If you recall, after David sleeps with or commits adultery and fornication with Bathsheba, the prophet Nathan says something very similar after his little story in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 7. He says, you are the man. This is the story where he talks about, the rich man wanted a lamb that belonged to a poor man, and he took it. But he says the same basic phrase, you are the man. And Daniel says the same thing. It is you, O king, who have done this, who have become strong and grown. In verse 23 it says, and because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, come down from heaven, saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, and the tender grass of the field, and let him be wet with the dew of heaven, and let his portion be with the beasts of the field, till 7 periods of time pass over him. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox. You shall be wet with the dew of heaven, and 7 periods of time shall pass over you, till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. So in this story, it would be easy to kind of just dismay, give up, well, God has told his prophet that I'm gonna fall, and I'm gonna have to go out and live with the beast. I don't think that he understands at this point how technical this is gonna end up being, or how literal this is gonna end up being. But it would be easy to give up, and I think that sometimes we do, and we have warnings from God today saying, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen to you. If you don't do this, or if you do these things, this is what's going to happen. The New Testament is rife with God saying, if you aren't this person, this is what's going to happen to you. And if you are this kind of person, I don't have a place for you. And when we have these warnings, it's easy for us to get dismayed or to give up. We lose hope. We lose heart. But when God gives us a warning, just like it is here, just like Daniel suggests here, it isn't a time to give up hope. It's a time to turn away. It's a time to turn away and turn back. You see, when God gives a warning, the warning isn't this is going to happen. It's if you continue in this, this is going to happen. You see, a lot of the times we don't emphasize everything equally sometimes within the body of believers. And when it comes to salvation, we in the Church of Christ, we tend to put baptism at the most important thing. I think that's a false way of looking at it. I'm not going to say that baptism isn't as important as we say it is. What I'm going to tell you is it's all equal. Because baptism means nothing without repentance and confession. And so while we will always teach the truth about baptism, we can't forget to teach people about repentance. And that throughout history, God has declared that lawbreakers have consequences. And he's not going to wash you of your sins if you're not willing to stop breaking the law. And we see here Daniel is pleading with this king, turn away from this. These things that you're doing, the things that you're not supposed to do, turn away from them. He's not commanding him. He's not browbeating him, pointing the finger, condemning him. He's saying, please. He is pleading with this man. Do we have that attitude with people now? When we see somebody living in sin, or we see somebody doing things we don't necessarily think that they should do, or that even we know that they shouldn't do we have that same mentality, that same approach? Do we grieve over the state of their soul? Or do we just get this self-righteous anger within us about wanting to condemn their actions and condemn them in the process? It's important to point out when somebody's living in sin. But what is your intentions behind it? Is it to lift yourself up? Or is it to lift them up? Because your intentions behind that action will change how you speak to them. That hard approach that we sometimes take all too quickly, it really needs to be a last resort for us. And we see this in the example that when Jesus tells us about how to rebuke a brother that lives in sin within the church, it's not about tongue wagging or pointing the finger at them. He says, go to them and tell them what they're doing is wrong. This is not a point of condemnation. This is a point of making sure that they understand truth. Because maybe they just don't know. But let me ask you something. Has it ever been that you've done something that you thought was right, that was wrong, and somebody approaches you? If they approach you with this commanding, arrogant, violent voice, this over-authoritative personality, are you going to respond properly to that? You see, when somebody goes on the offense, when we feel attacked, we are inevitably going to defend ourselves. That's human nature. That's not going to go away. That's true for believers. It's true for non-believers. And we have to remember that when we're going to approach somebody and correct something with them, we have to do it in such a way that's not going to shoot up walls. Because, see, if your response to somebody causes them to build up a wall, while on one hand that is their responsibility, they are responsible for their actions, and I agree with that. But have you not become a stumbling block to them? And so I think from this we see the way Daniel approaches wrongdoing, and we see the way Daniel approaches course correction with the king. And I think that we would do well to take that into consideration in our own lives when it comes time for us to correct other people. In verse 28, we're going to see that regardless of whether Nebuchadnezzar actually respects Daniel's advice or not, it's all short-lived. Kings tend to forget good advice. This came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, "Is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power, as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty?" While the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from the heaven. "O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. And 7 periods of time shall pass over you, until you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will." And so we see after 1 year, just 1 year after this dream and interpretation from Daniel, King Nebuchadnezzar, maybe in a moment of passion, maybe he legitimately forgot about this situation. In our minds, we would say, well, that's stupid. How can you forget something like that? How can you forget that warning? But, to be honest with you, I've had people give me advice, and less than 24 hours later, I don't remember what they just told me. So while we look at this, and because we know the story, we see this as this big pivotal point in the life of a king who gets advice from a dozen people every single day. I mean, he probably just didn't remember it. But whether he did or not, this is all about his mindset. It's all about where his heart is. You see, this man has grown too proud. And that's really the problem that we're going to see with King Nebuchadnezzar. We've seen it. We're going to see it repeatedly in his story. Is his pride gets in his way of serving God. But God's going to use him as an example. He's going to teach the people a message from this. and show the proper point of authority, the proper realm of authority, showing that all of these, no matter how powerful you think you are, you're still going to answer to me. And so in order to prove to King Nebuchadnezzar his proper place, God decrees that he's going to live like an ox, is essentially what we're looking at here. He's going to go out to the fields of the beast. He's going to eat grass. His hair is going to grow long. It's going to say as long as an eagle's feathers. I mean, this man is literally living like an insane person. Now, this story, actually, I was looking at some different papers and things written on this, and this story has been so interesting to psychologists that they actually have come up with names for that situation, for the belief that one is an animal. And while I had them written down, I don't remember them off the top of my head because it wasn't a super important part of this. But I just find it interesting that in the world today, we have professional doctors who, while they may not be Christians, still look at the Bible, and they use that to come up with new ideas. A book that was written thousands of years ago. Seems to me that we're all too quick to put it down on a shelf, and we're all too slow to pick it back up. In verse 33, it says, "Immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar, and he was driven from among men, and ate grass like an ox. And his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws." Continuing on, at the end of the days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, that is, after 7 years have passed. And my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven. And among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can stay his hand or say to him, "What have you done?" And at the same time my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven. For all his works are right, and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. We have here really, in my opinion, the most clear-cut example of what humility is meant. It means in the Bible. There's so often we have this idea that humility means like beating yourself down or degrading yourself or viewing yourself as worthless. But humility, as the scriptures depict to us, is more about knowing your place. In the grand scheme of things, humility is about knowing where you line up and understanding that God is always above you, infinitely above you. It doesn't matter how big you get, it doesn't matter how great you get. Humility is about knowing your place and knowing your worth, not making yourself worthless. And it really, I've always struggled with this because you see really two types of Christians that have it wrong. You have the ones that stick their nose up in the air and ignore the people beneath them. And you have the people that put their nose on the ground and drag their knuckles because they feel like they're just so worthless. And they feel like they're so valueless in the grand scheme of things. But it's really our job to look around the world and look around in our lives, find those opportunities that are open to us. And we let God work in those moments. And in this, we gain value. That is our work. That is our purpose. And it's okay to take some pride in that. You see, pride itself is not the sin. The sin is because when we allow our pride to be turned inward. You see, I can be proud of the work that's been done in my life as long as I understand that work was done ultimately by God. So this idea that we're supposed to be doing works and never viewing them as good enough because, well, I have to stay humble, that's just not the example that God shows us in the Bible. Being humble is about making sure that in our hearts we understand that any good thing that happens ultimately is because God allowed it. And in this, we keep our position. We remind ourselves of our place within the grand scheme of things. And when the Bible talks about somebody who suffers from the sin of pride, it's not that they took pride in something that they did. It's not that, they viewed themselves as valuable. It's because they placed themselves above God. Or equally as sinful, they placed themselves above God's other children. To me, I think that Nebuchadnezzar here, he shows us an example of this, and I think that it's okay to drive that point and beat that dead horse because one way or the other, we're suffering in the church. One way or the other, the people who call themselves children of God are suffering from an overinflated sense of ego or this issue of having complete and utter feelings of self-worthlessness. And nothing in Scripture allows for that. Now, as for the historical correctness of the story, and I only bring this up because a lot of people think that this might be more allegory than technical. I say people, I do mean biblical scholars. A lot of theologians have maintained that this story about Nebuchadnezzar, because of the nature of it, they believe it's an allegory. They don't think that it's a literal part of human history. But in my research, I found that a man named I'm going to get this wrong, Epidanes, I believe is how it is, a Greek historian, in the year 268 BC, wrote that Nebuchadnezzar was possessed by some god and that he had immediately disappeared. He then continues on in his book and says that Nebuchadnezzar appears about 7 years ago. Now the important bit is this Greek historian was not a Jew and was not a Christian. He had no ties to that faith. And we know that because when he writes it, he doesn't give credit to Yahweh, which is how they would have addressed the Jewish God. He just says he was possessed by some god. And so I think, and while yes, we don't need extra biblical sources, I think that it helps convict us about things when we can view people who aren't Christians and aren't godly people, and they are backing up the stories that we see in the Bible. And especially with the Old Testament, because there is a lot of the times where we have to question, is this an allegory, which is simply meaning, is this just a symbolic story that's meant to teach us a lesson, or did this truly happen? And we can rest on an answer when we see outside of the Bible that other people have also wrote about this event, and all of the facts line up. And interestingly enough, as for that goes, every time we've come across some writing by some other source, the facts have always lined up. At no point has a historian been discovered that wrote about some events in the Bible and it contradicted what the Bible said about it. Now, it might contradict reasons, purposes, things like that, but the actual events themselves almost always line up. And I think that's just something interesting to look at. It helps convict us of our faith in times of doubt. Now, here in a little bit, we're going to sing some songs and worship, and then we're going to look at Daniel 5. Now, briefly, I just want to explain, Daniel 5 is no longer about King Nebuchadnezzar. I'm going to talk a little bit about why the change in people. But this is the end of Nebuchadnezzar's story. I hope that you got as much out of this as I did. I hope that it convicted you as much as it did me. But we're going to close out, and I want to thank you guys for listening and participating.